In the mid-16th century, when most of Europe was still struggling with internal wars and fragile borders, the Tsardom of Russia faced a relentless threat from the south and east, the powerful Tatar and Mongol successor states that had once dominated the region for centuries. At the center of this turning point stood Ivan IV, later known to history as Ivan the Terrible, a ruler whose name became synonymous with brutality, paranoia, and iron-fisted expansion. The conflict, often exaggerated in modern media as a single gigantic massacre, was in reality a series of brutal campaigns, raids, and counter-raids between Muscovite forces and the remnants of the Mongol Golden Horde, particularly the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates. Russia at this time was not yet an empire. It was a growing state surrounded by hostile territories, and Ivan's rule marked the moment when Muscovy shifted from defense to aggressive conquest. The Mongol legacy still haunted Russian lands through constant slave raids, burned villages, and captured civilians sold in distant markets. These attacks were not occasional, they were systemic and economically driven, forcing Ivan to respond with equally ruthless military organization and expansionist ambition.
Ivan's early reign was shaped by instability, betrayal within the nobility, and deep psychological scars from childhood neglect and violence in the royal court. By the 1550s, he began restructuring the Russian military, introducing new formations, artillery units, and centralized command systems that differed from the fragmented feudal armies of earlier times. His campaigns against the Kazan Khanate in 1552 were decisive and historically documented. The Siege of Kazan was not a single clash of horsemen, but a prolonged military operation involving cannons, fortified lines, and engineered assaults. Russian forces used heavy artillery, mining tunnels beneath walls, and coordinated infantry pushes, tactics that demonstrated a shift toward more modern warfare. The fall of Kazan was catastrophic for the Tatar defenders, resulting in mass casualties, forced conversions, and the destruction of much of the city. While numbers like 120,000 horsemen are often cited in dramatic retellings, historians generally agree these figures are symbolic exaggerations meant to emphasize scale rather than precise counts. What is undeniable, however, is that the conquest permanently weakened the Tatar power structure and opened the Volga River corridor to Russian control.
Following Kazan, Ivan turned his attention to Astrakhan in 1556, another strategic victory that extended Russian dominance to the Caspian Sea. These conquests were not merely territorial, they reshaped trade routes, economic control, and cultural demographics across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The Mongol successor states had relied heavily on cavalry warfare, fast raids, mobility, and psychological terror, but Russian artillery and fortified positions began neutralizing those advantages. The violence during these campaigns was extreme on both sides. Entire settlements were razed, prisoners were executed or enslaved, and religious sites were destroyed. Ivan's later years became darker as he established the Oprichlina, a secret police and military faction loyal only to him, which unleashed terror not only on external enemies but also on Russian citizens. This internal brutality blurred the line between military necessity and personal tyranny. While battles against Mongol and Tatar forces were historically real and often massive, the mythologized image of a single apocalyptic massacre oversimplifies a decade of sustained warfare, shifting alliances, and regional upheaval. By the end of Ivan's reign, the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe had fundamentally changed. The once dominant Mongol influence that had shaped Russian history for over 2 centuries was effectively dismantled, replaced by a centralized and expanding Russian state. Yet this victory came at immense human cost. The campaigns drained resources, devastated populations, and entrenched a culture of fear and authoritarian control that echoed long after Ivan's death. His legacy remains deeply controversial. To some, he was a strategic ruler who secured Russia's borders and broke centuries of subjugation. To others, he was a tyrant whose cruelty and paranoia inflicted irreversible damage on his own people. The stories of massive cavalry slaughters and overwhelming victories endure because they capture the emotional intensity of an era defined by survival and domination. But the true history is less about a single battlefield annihilation and more about sustained military evolution, political consolidation, and the brutal realities of 16th-century power struggles where victory was measured not only in land gained, but in how completely an enemy's influence was erased.